You ever notice how sometimes it's not the noise that warns you something's wrong, but the silence? The building was supposed to hum at 62 decibels on a Tuesday morning, a steady mechanical rhythm running through the walls like a heartbeat no one questioned, but Marcus Reed heard something else as he stepped off the service elevator on the 18th floor. Or rather, he heard what wasn't there, a missing vibration, a gap so subtle most people would walk straight through it without a second thought. But Marcus paused, one hand still resting on the handle of his maintenance cart, his head tilting, slightly as if the air itself had whispered something only he could understand. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, barely noticeable, just a fraction of a second too long between pulses, and then everything returned to normal, or what everyone else believed was normal. A young analyst brushed past him without making eye contact, heels clicking fast against the polished floor, phone pressed to her ear, talking numbers, deadlines, things that sounded urgent but felt strangely disconnected from the quiet imbalance Marcus could feel settling under the surface. He glanced down at the digital panel mounted beside the wall, temperature steady at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, airflow nominal, pressure levels within acceptable range, everything reading exactly as it should, and yet something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet refusal to ignore what didn't sit right. Probably just a sensor lag. Someone muttered behind him, another maintenance guy rolling. His cart passed without slowing down. Happens all the time. Marcus didn't respond. He rarely did. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he understood something most people didn't, that being heard and being right were rarely the same thing in places like this. He reached out and lightly tapped the side of the panel. Not to fix it, just to feel it, the faint vibration traveling through the metal casing into his fingertips. And there was again that absence like a drumbeat. Missing a note, small enough to ignore, big enough to matter, down the hallway. Glass doors slid open and a group of executives stepped out, their voices controlled, their pace sharp. And at the center of them was Claire Whitmore, posture straight, eyes forward, every movement precise, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. She passed Marcus without looking, not out of cruelty, just efficiency, the kind that filters the world into what matters and what doesn't. And in that moment, Marcus Reed was categorized without a word, invisible, part of the background that kept everything running but never needed to be seen. He didn't take it personally. He lived most of his life in that space, the unnoticed edges where real things quietly happened. But as the doors closed behind her and the hallway returned to its usual rhythm, Marcus kept standing there, listening, because something in that silence didn't belong. And he knew from years of fixing things that when something doesn't belong, it doesn't stay quiet forever, it just waits. Marcus did not log the issue right away. Not because he did not care, but because he had learned that systems like this one did not respond well to uncertainty without proof. So he moved on with his morning checklist, replacing filters, tightening loose fittings, adjusting airflow valves that everyone else assumed adjusted themselves. His movements steady, efficient, almost invisible in the flow of the building. But his mind kept circling back to that missing vibration, that quiet gap that did not belong. Around 10:15 a.m., he found himself back near the same panel, this time kneeling beside it as if checking something routine, his fingers brushing along the edge again, feeling for that subtle inconsistency. And there it was, still wrong, still quiet in a way it should not be. He glanced down the hallway, then reached in his pocket and pulled out his phone, snapping a quick photo of the panel readings, not for evidence. Not yet, just something to remember, a reference point in case. The silence turned into something louder later. "You still stuck on that thing?" The same maintenance worker from earlier leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with a half-smile that carried more dismissal than curiosity. Marcus stood slowly, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. "It is nothing," he said calmly, not because he believed it, but because he knew the conversation would not go anywhere useful. The man shrugged. "Exactly, that is what I said," and walked off, leaving Marcus alone again with the quiet hum of the building, except it was not quite a hum, not anymore. By noon, the energy shifted upstairs as preparations for the product launch reached their peak. Conference rooms filled, screens lit up, voices layered over each other in controlled urgency. Claire Whitmore moved through it all with sharp precision, reviewing reports, adjusting timelines, her presence tightening the air around her in a way that made people stand straighter, think faster, speak less. Marcus caught a glimpse of her again from the far end of the corridor. Just a moment, her reflection passing across the glass wall before disappearing into a secured room. And for a second, he wondered what she would hear if she stopped, moving long enough to listen. But people like her did not stop. Not today, not with millions of dollars and reputations balanced on a flawless execution. At 1:07 p.m., Marcus finally entered a brief note into the internal system, a standard maintenance flag. Nothing urgent, just a line that read slight irregularity in airflow vibration on level 18 panel B, recommend inspection. He hit submit and watched as it disappeared into the queue, one notification among hundreds already buried. Beneath more visible priorities, he knew what would happen next. It would sit there unassigned, unnoticed, until either someone else confirmed it or the system forced attention by failing. That was how things worked. Not broken until it stopped working. Not important until it interrupted something bigger. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling. Not in defeat, but in quiet understanding. He had done what was expected, maybe even a little more. But the silence was still there, still waiting, and deep down, he knew that sometimes the difference between a normal day and a disaster was not whether someone noticed the problem, but whether someone refused to ignore it long enough to act. By late afternoon, the building felt fuller, not louder, just heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. And Marcus noticed at the moment he stepped back onto the 18th floor, the same panel now glowing steady and calm, as if nothing had ever been off. But he did not trust it because the silence had not changed. It had settled. And that was worse. He crouched again, slower this time, pressing his palm flat against the metal, closing his eyes for a brief second, listening through. Touch more than sound, and the absence was still there, deeper now, like something beneath the system was drawing energy in a way it should not. "You're going to wear a hole in that wall," a voice called out from behind him, a young technician holding a tablet, barely stopping as he passed. "We have already got clearance on all systems for tomorrow. You can relax." Marcus opened his eyes and pulled his hand away, nodding once, not arguing, not explaining, just absorbing the words the way he. Attention, he opened it carefully, the hinges soft from lack of use. And inside, everything looked normal. Wires aligned, indicators green, nothing out of place, and yet the same quiet imbalance pressed against him, subtle but persistent, like a question that refused to be answered. He checked the time, 5:08 p.m., most of the upper floors beginning to thin out as teams wrapped up for the evening. But the core systems would remain active through the night, preparing for the morning launch, increasing load gradually, syncing data, balancing power distribution across the building. And that was when Marcus understood, not all at once, not like a revelation, but like pieces falling into place exactly where they had always belonged. Whatever was wrong would not show itself under normal conditions. It was waiting for the system to reach full capacity. For the moment, everything depended on it working perfectly. He stood there for a long second, the quiet pressing in around him. And then he reached up and gently closed the panel, his movements deliberate, calm, as if he had already made a decision he had not spoken out loud. Because sometimes the most dangerous problems were the ones that knew how to stay hidden until it was too late. And Marcus Reed had never been the kind of man who waited for things to break before he tried to fix them. Marcus did not clock out when his shift ended. Even though the system marked him done at 6 p.m., even though most of the building had already begun its quiet transition into night mode, lights dimming slightly, conversations fading into the low echo of distant footsteps, he simply moved differently now. Slower, more deliberate, as if every step carried a decision he had already made hours ago. He stopped by the maintenance office just long enough to set his cart back in place, leaving it exactly where it belonged, then reached into his locker and pulled out a small handheld diagnostic tool, older than the ones issued by the company, but more reliable in ways that did not show up on paper. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and walked back toward the service elevator without saying a word to anyone. Outside the glass walls of the building, the city was still alive, headlights stretching down the streets in long lines of white and red, but inside, Everything felt quieter, controlled, contained. At 6:42 p.m., he stepped onto the 18th floor again, this time with no one else around. The hallway empty, the air cooler, the system beginning its gradual ramp up for overnight processing, and that was when the silence changed, not louder, not obvious, just tighter, like something pulling inward beneath the surface. Marcus paused in the center of the corridor, listening, his breathing slow, steady, matching the rhythm he expected to feel in the walls. But it was off, still off, and now it carried a faint, irregular pulse, something that should not have been there at all. He moved toward the primary panel and opened it without hesitation, the soft click of the latch echoing slightly in the empty space. Inside, the indicators still read normal, green across the board, but the deeper system beneath those readings told a different story. He connected his handheld device, watching as the raw data scrolled across the small screen, numbers shifting faster now, patterns emerging at the standard interface, smoothed over, and there it was, a cascading imbalance in the load distribution, subtle at first, but growing, feeding into itself in a loop that would not correct on its own. Marcus exhaled slowly, not surprised, just confirmed. He checked the time again, 6:49 p.m. The system was still in early phase, still manageable, but by morning, when full capacity hit, the imbalance would compound, pushing stress into parts of the system that were not designed to handle it. Not an explosion, not something dramatic, just failure, quiet and total, systems shutting down one by one until nothing responded the way it should. He reached for the internal communication panel, his hand hovering for a second as he considered sending another report, something stronger this time, something that might get attention. But he already knew how that would go. Delays, questions, layers of approval that would take hours he did not have, and the system would keep building pressure while people decided who was responsible for fixing it. Marcus lowered his hand, the decision settling into him without resistance. He turned back to the open panel, his movements calm, precise, as if he had been here before, because in a way he had, not in this building, not with this system, but in every moment where something small was ignored until it became something too big to stop. He adjusted the first connection point carefully, watching the data shift. Not fixing yet, just understanding, mapping the problem in real time. Because if he was going to do this, he needed to be certain, not loud, not visible, just right. Marcus did not rush, even though the numbers on his handheld device were beginning to shift faster now. Even though the imbalance was no longer subtle, but quietly building in a way that would not reverse on its own, he moved with the same steady rhythm he used when fixing something small in his apartment, like a loose cabinet hinge or a flickering light above his daughter's desk, because rushing meant guessing, and guessing was how problems like this got worse. He adjusted a secondary node, just a fraction, watching the data respond in real time, the cascading loop slowing for a moment before trying to correct itself in the wrong direction again. All right, he murmured under his breath, not frustrated, just acknowledging what the system was trying to do. He traced the pattern deeper, following the load path as it redistributed across channels that were never meant to carry that kind of weight. And that was when he saw it clearly, a minor configuration error buried beneath layers of automated adjustments, something that had likely been updated during a routine patch, small enough to pass every standard check. But under full capacity, it would amplify, not stabilize. Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaling as the understanding settled in. It was not one problem. It was a chain, and fixing the wrong part first would trigger the rest. He glanced at the time, 7:06 p.m. The system's still climbing toward peak overnight load, still giving him a window, but not a large one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, something his daughter had drawn earlier that week, a simple sketch of the two of them standing in front of their apartment, her handwriting uneven but clear beneath it. If something feels wrong, fix it, Daddy. He looked at it for a second longer than necessary, then folded it back carefully and returned it to his pocket, his shoulders settling as if that small reminder had aligned something inside him. He turned back to the panel, his movements more decisive now, not faster, just certain. He began isolating the affected loop, rerouting load manually in a way the automated system could not interpret, guiding it away from the unstable path. Each adjustment small, control, like tuning an instrument that had drifted out of key. The data shifted again, resisting at first, then slowly responding, the irregular pulse smoothing just slightly, not fixed yet, but no longer escalating. Marcus watched closely, his eyes steady, not looking for confirmation, but for truth, because systems like this did not reward assumptions, they exposed them. He adjusted one more connection, then paused, letting the system settle, letting it speak back through the numbers on his screen. For a moment, nothing changed, and then, gradually, the pattern began to stabilize, the cascading effect slowing, the load redistributing along the correct channels. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to prevent the chain reaction he had seen forming. Marcus did not smile, did not relax. He simply nodded once to himself because this was only the beginning. He had stopped the escalation, but the system still needed a hold, and that meant staying with it, watching, adjusting, making sure the silence he heard earlier returned to what it was supposed to be, not absence, but balance. The system did not fail, but it did not fully trust itself either. And Marcus could feel that hesitation in the way the data moved, not smooth, not clean, but cautious, like something recovering from misstep. It almost did not survive. He stayed where he was, crouched in front of the open panel, the faint glow of indicators reflecting off his hands as he monitored each shift in real time. 7:18 p.m. The load continuing to rise as scheduled processes layered on top of each other, preparing for the morning launch. And this was the part most people never saw, not the big moment, not the presentation, but the quiet hours where everything either held together or quietly fell apart. Marcus adjusted one more parameter, smaller than the others, almost insignificant on its own, but necessary to stabilize the path he had rerouted, and the response came slower this time, delayed, as if the system was testing the change before accepting it. He waited, not touching anything, just watching, because patience was part of the work, knowing when to act, and when to let the system settle into what it needed to become. The irregular pulse that had been hiding beneath the surface began to flatten, not disappear, but align, the missing rhythm returning in fragments, piece by piece, until the silence he had noticed earlier shifted again, no longer empty, no longer wrong, but balanced in a way that felt almost invisible unless you were listening for it. Marcus leaned back slightly, resting his weight on his heels, his shoulders easing just enough to acknowledge that the worst of it had passed, but he did not close the panel. Not yet, because he knew better than to walk away too early. Systems like this could appear stable before they truly were, and he had seen enough to know that a premature exit could undo everything he had just corrected. Across the building, far above him, lights still burned in the executive floor. Claire Whitmore remained in her office, reviewing final confirmations, her screen filled with green indicators, every department reporting readiness, every system marked as optimal, because from her vantage point, everything was working exactly as it should. There was no alert, no warning, no sign that anything had ever been close to failing. And that was the point. Marcus checked his handheld device again, the data now flowing in a consistent pattern, the load distribution holding steady across channels that had previously strained under imbalance. He allowed himself a single slow breath. Not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Then he reached forward and secured the final adjustment, locking the configuration into place so the system would not revert under higher demand. The interface flickered once, then stabilized, confirming the change without drawing attention to it. Just another quiet update in a long chain of operations. Marcus disconnected his device and closed the panel with a soft click, the sound barely echoing in the empty hallway. He stood up, stretching his back slightly, the kind of small movement that comes after holding still for too long. And for a moment, he just stood there, listening again, not for what was wrong, but for what had returned, the steady hum, the consistent rhythm, the absence of absence. And that was enough. He turned and began walking toward the elevator, his steps unhurried, blending back into the quiet structure of the building as if he had never stepped out of it at all, leaving behind a system that would now carry thousands of operations without hesitation, without failure, without anyone ever knowing how close it had come to doing otherwise. The next morning arrived without hesitation, the city already awake before the sun fully settled between the buildings. And inside the tower, everything moved exactly as planned. Screens lit up one by one, systems synchronized, data streams flowing clean and uninterrupted, as if nothing had ever been at risk. Marcus stepped into the building at 7:10 a.m., coffee in hand, his pace steady, unremarkable. Just another worker starting another shift. He nodded once to the security guard, received the same casual nod back, and moved toward the service elevator without drawing attention, because nothing about this morning required attention. Not for him. Not anymore. On the executive floor, Claire Whitmore stood at the head of a long conference table. Her team gathered around her, laptops open, voices low but confident, every metric displayed in front of them showing stability, performance, precision. "We are fully operational," one of the engineers said, scrolling through the system logs. "Load distribution is holding perfectly across all channels." Claire did not respond immediately, her eyes scanning the data, looking for inconsistencies that were no longer there because whatever had been wrong was gone, not flagged, not recorded in a way that raised concern, just corrected quietly, cleanly. Marcus reached the 18th floor again, pushing his car down the same hallway where the silence had first caught his attention. But this time, the hum was there, steady at 62 decibels, the vibration consistent, the rhythm complete. He did not stop, did not check the panel right away, because he did not need to. He could hear it in the air, feel it in the floor beneath his boots. Everything was working. At 8:03 a.m., the official launch began. Screens across the building displaying live metrics, numbers climbing in real time, thousands of operations processed per second, every system responding exactly as designed. Applause broke out in the conference room. Controlled but real, a release of tension that had built for weeks. Claire allowed herself a small nod, not a smile, but something close. Acknowledgement that the execution had met her expectations. "Excellent work," she said, her voice calm, measured, and the room absorbed it like validation, like proof that everything had gone right, because from their perspective, it had. Marcus stopped briefly near the panel, just long enough to rest his hand against it again, not to check, not to fix, just to listen, and the system answered the way it was supposed to, with quiet consistency, nothing missing, nothing hidden. He removed his hand and continued down the hallway, replacing a filter further down, adjusting a vent that needed slight calibration, the kind of work that never made it into reports, never appeared on screens, but kept everything running the way it should. Upstairs, one of the engineers paused, frowning slightly a line in the system log. "That is strange," he said, scrolling back. "There was a manual override last night. The room shifted just slightly, not alarmed, just curious." "Override?" Claire asked, her tone still controlled. The engineer nodded. "Yes, around 7 p.m., small adjustments. Nothing critical now, but it stabilized the load imbalance before peak." Claire's eyes narrowed just a fraction, her attention sharpening. "Who authorized it?" she asked, the question quiet but precise. The engineer hesitated, checking again. "It does not show a request ticket," he said slowly. "Just the action and the user ID." Claire stepped closer to the screen, her reflection merging with the data for a brief moment as she read the name. Marcus Reed. And for the first time since she had walked past him the day before, the name did not pass through her awareness unnoticed. It stayed. And somewhere between the silence that had been corrected and the success now being celebrated, a small shift occurred, not in the system, but in the way she began to see the space around her, because sometimes the most important work is not the work that gets recognized, but the work that makes recognition possible. Claire did not speak right away, not because she did not understand what she was seeing, but because she did, and that made it harder to ignore. Her eyes remained on the screen for a moment longer than necessary. The name's still there, simple, unremarkable, easy to overlook if you were not looking for it. "Find him," she said finally, her voice calm, but different now, more focused. The engineer nodded and stepped away, already pulling up internal directories, while the rest of the room returned to their metrics, their success, their confirmation that everything had gone exactly as planned, because from their perspective, it had. But Claire did not move, her attention no longer on the performance charts, but on the absence of a problem that should have existed, the kind of absence that does not happen on its own. Down on the 18th floor, Marcus was halfway through replacing a vent filter when the elevator doors opened behind him, the soft chime echoing lightly through the corridor. He did not turn immediately, not out of indifference, just habit, finishing what he had started before shifting his attention. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. And when he finally stood and turned, Claire Whitmore was already there, closer than he expected, her presence filling the quiet space in a way that made everything else seem less defined. She looked at him directly this time. Not past him, not through him, but at him as if. Aligning what she saw now with something she had only just realized she had missed. "Marcus Reed," she said, confirming more than asking. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." His voice steady, respectful, without tension, because he did not assume what this moment meant. Claire glanced briefly at the panel beside him, then back at his face. "You made changes to the system last night." It was not a question. Marcus held her gaze for a second, then answered simply, "Yes." No explanation, no justification, just the truth. Claire studied him, not searching for confidence or hesitation, but for something harder to define, intention, perhaps, or understanding. "Why was there no escalation?" she asked, her tone still controlled, but quieter now, the kind of question that mattered more than it sounded. Marcus shifted his weight slightly. Not uncomfortable, just grounded. "I logged it," he said. "It was not picked up." Claire's eyes flickered for a brief moment. Not surprise, not quite. Frustration, just recognition. The system had worked exactly as designed. And that was the problem. "So you decided to intervene," she said, and this time there was a trace of something beneath her words. Not disapproval, not approval, just awareness. Marcus nodded once. "It needed to be fixed before load increased," he said, his voice even, as if stating something obvious. Claire took a slow breath, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor, then returning to him. "Do you understand what could have happened if you were wrong?" The question hung between them, not as a challenge, but as a boundary. Marcus did not answer immediately. Not because he did not know, but because he chose his words carefully. "Yes," he said, "that is why I made sure I was not." The silence that followed was not empty. It held weight, not tension, just a shift in how the space between them existed. Claire looked at him for a moment longer, something in her expression changing, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to alter the way she stood, the way she saw him. "And if you had not acted?" she asked quietly. Marcus did not hesitate this time. "It would have failed," he said. No emphasis, no dramatics, just a statement. And in that simplicity, the scale of what had been prevented became clear in a way no report could fully capture. Claire exhaled slowly, her posture adjusting, not softer, but different. "Next time," she said, her voice measured, "you come directly to me." Marcus held her gaze and nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." And for a moment, neither of them moved, the system humming steadily around them, balanced, invisible, doing exactly what it was meant to do. And in that quiet, something else had shifted as well, something neither of them named, but both understood. Claire did not linger after that, not because the moment had ended, but because she understood it had already said what it needed to say. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and walking back toward the elevator, her steps measured, controlled, but different now, as if something in her pace had adjusted to a rhythm she had not noticed before. Marcus watched her go for a brief second, then turned back to the vent in front of him, finishing the task he had paused, tightening the final screw, sliding the panel back into place with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. Because for him, the moment had not changed the work. It had only confirmed it. Upstairs, the celebration continued in a more subdued form. Emails sent, reports finalized, stakeholders informed that everything had executed without error. Claire returned to her office, closing the glass door behind her. The city stretching out beyond her in clean lines and distant movement. She stood there for a moment, not looking at the skyline, but at her own reflection layered over it. And for the first time that morning, she did not immediately reach for her tablet or her phone. Instead, she replayed the conversation in her mind. Not the words themselves, but the space between them, the certainty in his voice, the absence of hesitation, the way he had said it would have failed without adding anything more, no exaggeration. No need to impress, just truth. She turned away from the window and walked back to her desk, tapping once on the screen to bring up the system logs again. The same line, the same timestamp, Marcus Reed. She let the name sit there for a second longer before closing the file. Not because it was unimportant, but because she had already understood what it meant. Down on the 18th floor, Marcus moved through the rest of his shift the same way he always did, checking systems, making small adjustments, ensuring everything stayed the way it was supposed to be, unnoticed and steady. At 11:42 a.m., he took a short break, sitting in a quiet corner near the service corridor, pulling the folded drawing from his pocket again, smoothing it out with his hand. His daughter's handwriting still uneven but certain. He smiled slightly, not wide, not expressive, just enough to acknowledge the weight of it, then folded it back and returned it to his pocket, standing up to continue his work because there was always more to maintain, more to keep balanced, more to notice before it became something else. Later that afternoon, a new internal directive circulated quietly through the system, not announced, not emphasized, just present, a change in escalation protocol, allowing direct reporting channels for critical observations regardless of role or department. Most people skimmed past it, accepting it as another procedural update, but its origin traced back to a single line in a system log, a single moment that had not made headlines, had not interrupted a presentation, had not required recovery, because it had been handled before it ever needed to be, and somewhere between the noise of success and the silence of prevention, something had shifted in a way that would not be easily undone.